The message arrived at exactly 3:27 Earth Standard Time. Ambassador Keith Bennett was reviewing colony development reports when his desk console lit up with the highest priority alert he had ever seen. His eyes widened as he read the formal summons to appear before the full Galactic Council. "They want me there in 3 days," Keith said, looking up at his assistant who had rushed into the office after receiving the same alert. "The full council?" Diane Miller asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "That hasn't happened since we joined the Confederation." Keith stood and walked to the large window of the Earth Embassy on Alpha Centauri Prime. The space station's curved structures gleamed against the backdrop of stars. For 5 years, humanity had been the newest member of a galactic community that spanned thousands of light years and included over 400 different species. Most of those species had known each other for centuries or even millennia. Humans were still the newcomers, still finding their place. "Call everyone in," he said. "Security team, analysts, military liaison. I want to know exactly why they're calling this meeting now." Within an hour, the embassy's main conference room was filled with the top members of Earth's diplomatic team. Colonel Stephen Wright, the military liaison, spoke first. 3 more border colonies have reported exertion ships in their space. New Montana sent this footage yesterday. The screen showed shaky images of sleek, predatory vessels with the distinctive purple markings of the Exertion Empire. They hung in orbit over a small agricultural colony, their weapon ports open in clear threat. "Casualties?" Keith asked. "None yet," Stephen replied. "But they're not just patrolling anymore. They're landing troops now, claiming they're securing disputed territories." Grace Patterson, the communications specialist, cleared her throat. "Ambassador, we've intercepted communications suggesting this is just the beginning. The Exertions are planning something bigger." "And the Council knows this?" Keith asked. Everyone in the room exchanged glances. Dr. Alan Ross, the science advisor, spoke up. "They must. Our reports go directly to the Confederation Security Committee. We've sent 17 urgent warnings in the past month alone." Keith nodded slowly. "And they've done nothing." "Worse than nothing," Lisa Murphy said from the corner of the room. The security chief had survived first contact, when humanity hadn't known if the stars held friends or enemies. Her face was marked with a scar from those uncertain days. "They've been blocking our requests to reinforce the colony defenses. Maintaining peaceful relations is what they call it." Keith turned back to the window, his reflection serious in the glass. "The Exergens have been pushing boundaries for decades, from what the Antharians told me. The Council's approach has always been appeasement, and now they want you there in person," Diane said. "This isn't about hearing our concerns. They're going to tell us to back down, aren't they?" Keith didn't answer immediately. He watched as a massive transport ship undocked from the station, its engines flaring blue as it prepared to jump to faster than light speed. "Prepare the Intrepid for departure," he finally said. "I want all intelligence on Exertion movements for the past year. I want population figures for all border colonies, and I want casualty projections if the Exertions launch a full invasion." "Sir," Stephen looked concerned. "You think it's that serious?" "I think," Keith said, turning to face his team, "that the Council has already decided what they want humanity to do. They expect us to nod and accept whatever compromise they've arranged. They expect us to be grateful for a seat at their table. And we're not going to do that," Lisa said. It wasn't a question. "No," Keith agreed, his voice firm. "We're going to show them exactly who they invited into their confederation. Gather everything we know. We leave for Galaxia Prime in 6 hours." As the team hurried to prepare, Keith remained at the window. 5 years of playing the diplomatic game, of careful words and polite deference to older species. 5 years of watching human interests sidelined for greater galactic stability. Perhaps it was time to change the rules of the game. The Earth vessel Intrepid pulled away from Alpha Centauri Prime, its engines glowing blue against the darkness of space. Inside, Keith Bennett stood in the ship's observation deck, watching as the massive space station grew smaller behind them. "We'll reach Galaxia Prime in 58 hours, Ambassador," said Captain Laura Harris as she joined him at the viewport. "That gives you 2 full days to prepare." Keith nodded. "Thank you, Captain. I'll need every minute." The journey to the Confederation capital was tense. Keith had converted the Intrepid's main conference room into a war room, with screens displaying maps of human colonies, search movements, and intelligence reports. His team worked in shifts, barely sleeping as they built their case. "These are the latest images from New Montana," Grace Patterson said during their 6th briefing. She projected a series of pictures showing search ships landing on the colony surface. "They're claiming it's a peacekeeping mission, but our people on the ground report they're setting up weapon placements." Diane Miller shook her head as she studied the data. "The Council will say this is just a misunderstanding. They always do." "Not this time," Keith said firmly. "Not with this evidence." Dr. Alan Ross entered the room carrying a small device. The science advisor looked like he hadn't slept in days. "We've analyzed the technology the Exurgents are bringing to the border worlds," he said, placing the device on the table. It projected a 3D model of a large installation. "This isn't just for show. It's an energy matrix capable of destroying anything in orbit around those planets." "They're setting up a kill zone," Colonel Wright said, studying the projection. "Once these are active, we won't be able to evacuate the colonies if things go bad." Lisa Murphy, who had been quietly listening from the corner, finally spoke. "Let's stop pretending. The Exurgents aren't preparing for defense. This is the start of an invasion, and the Council knows it. The question is why they're letting it happen," Keith said. "The Confederation has enough combined firepower to stop the Exurgent Empire 10 times over." "Politics," Diane suggested. "The elder species have their own agreements with the Exurgents. Trade deals, technology exchanges. Or they just don't care about human worlds," Lisa added bitterly. "We're newcomers, expendable." The room fell silent as everyone considered this possibility. Keith walked around the table, looking at each member of his team. "When I speak to the Council, I need absolute certainty about our facts. No maybes, no probabless. If we're going to challenge them, we need to be right." For the next day, they refined their presentation. Keith practiced his speech, a careful diplomatic appeal that emphasized cooperation and mutual security. It was the kind of speech the Council would expect from Earth's representative, respectful, deferential, acknowledging humanity's junior status in galactic affairs. As they approached Galaxia Prime, the massive station came into view through the ship's viewports. Unlike the practical design of Earth stations, Galaxia Prime was a work of art, crystalline structures extending outward from a central hub, glittering against the backdrop of a colorful nebula. It had been built over thousands of years, each member species adding their own section as they joined the Confederation. The human section was still under construction, small compared to the ancient wings built by the founding species. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Colonel Wright said, joining Keith at the window. "Makes you feel small." "That's by design," Keith replied. "Everything about the Confederation is designed to remind newer species of their place." As the Intrepid docked, Keith received a new message from Earth. He read it silently, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Diane asked. "The Exurgents have fired on a human research vessel near New Montana. 23 dead." Keith closed the message and looked at the magnificent structure they were about to enter. "I need to rewrite my speech," he said quietly. "Sir, the one I prepared won't be necessary anymore." Keith's eyes were hard as he turned to his team. It's time the Confederation learned that humans don't play by everyone else's rules. The docking bay of Galaxia Prime was filled with representatives from dozens of species. Keith and his team were met by a tall, blue-skinned Antharian diplomat who introduced himself as Senior Greeter Zalvex. "Ambassador Bennett, welcome to the heart of our Confederation," Zalvex said, bowing slightly. "We hope your journey was pleasant." "Thank you," Keith replied with the practiced smile he had perfected over 5 years of diplomatic service. We're honored to be invited to address the full council. As they walked through the massive corridors of the station, Keith noticed how other diplomats watched their small group, some with curiosity, others with what seemed like pity. A group of elderly Drelthorians, one of the founding species of the Confederation, whispered among themselves as the humans passed. "Your quarters have been prepared in the outer ring," Zolvex explained, leading them to a transport pod. "The council session begins tomorrow at first light." "The outer ring?" Diane Miller asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I thought visiting delegations stayed in the central hub." Zolvex's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The central hub is currently occupied by the Exurgian diplomatic corps. They arrived last week for separate discussions." Keith and Stephen Wright exchanged glances. This confirmed what they had suspected, that Exurgians had been meeting with the council before the humans were even summoned. Their quarters were comfortable but small, located in the newest section of the station where younger member species were housed. After settling in, Keith called his team together. "We need to understand what we're walking into tomorrow," he said. "Grace, what have you learned from the station's information network?" Grace Patterson had been monitoring the station's public communications since they arrived. "There have been 6 closed sessions of the Security Committee in the past 2 weeks. No records of what was discussed, but the Exurgian representatives were present at all of them. And we weren't invited to any," Lisa Murphy noted darkly. "I spoke with a Fuileran historian while you were meeting the station administrator," Dr. Ross added. "He was more forthcoming than most. Apparently, there's been talk of creating development zones along the borders between human space and Exurgian territory." "Development zones?" Keith asked. "A diplomatic term for buffer regions. Essentially, they want us to abandon our border colonies to create neutral space between our territories and the Exurgian Empire." The room fell silent. Those colonies were home to millions of people. "They can't seriously expect us to agree to that," Diane said finally. "I don't think they expect us to agree," Keith replied. "I think they've already decided. This meeting is just to inform us of their decision." Over the next few hours, the team split up to gather more information. Keith himself visited the great observation deck that overlooked the council chamber. Even empty, it was impressive. 400 seats arranged in concentric circles, with the oldest and most powerful species seated in the innermost rings. The human seat was in the outermost circle, barely visible from the center, where speakers would address the council. As Keith stood there, he was joined by an elderly Velnaxi, a species known for their control of key trade routes. "First time seeing the Great Chamber, Ambassador?" the Velnaxi asked, its translator converting the clicking language into English. "Yes, it's impressive. It was designed to be a reminder of the proper order of things." The Velnaxi's compound eyes studied Keith. "Your species is very young, barely out of your gravity well, yet already causing such discussion." "We didn't come here to cause trouble," Keith said carefully. "No one ever does." The Velnaxi's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Yet tomorrow, the Grand Imperator Zox of the Exurgian Empire will propose restrictions on human expansion. For galactic stability, of course." "And how will the council vote?" Keith asked directly. The Velnaxi turned to leave. "The vote has already been decided, Ambassador. That is how things work here. The council makes decisions. Junior members accept them." As the alien walked away, Keith remained looking at the empty chamber, understanding finally dawning. The summons, the meetings, the diplomatic courtesies, all theater. The Confederation had already decided to sacrifice human interests to appease the Exurgians. His hand tightened on the railing as he made his decision. Morning on Galaxia Prime was an artificial dawn that spread across the curved ceiling of the massive station. Keith and his team arrived early at the council chamber, taking their assigned seat in the outermost ring. One by one, representatives from hundreds of species filed in, filling the great hall with a mix of voices, clicks, whistles, and electronic translations. The Exurgian delegation has 16 members, Lisa Murphy noted quietly. That's twice the normal size. Keith nodded, observing the purple-skinned Xerxians taking their place in the third ring, a position of considerable influence for a species that had joined the Confederation only a century before humans. Grand Imperator Zox looks pleased with himself, Diane added, gesturing subtly toward the Xerxian leader, whose tall crest of scales was fully extended in a display of confidence. The session began with ritual greetings from Elder Vexnor, the ancient Drelthorian who had chaired the council for over 200 years. His frail body was supported by a floating chair, but his voice carried strength as he welcomed the gathered representatives. Today we address matters of border security and territorial development, the elder announced. The council has reviewed reports from multiple sectors and will hear formal presentations before offering guidance. For 2 hours, representatives from various species discussed minor disputes and trade agreements. The human delegation waited patiently, recognizing the deliberate protocol that put newer members last on the agenda. Finally, Grand Imperator Zox approached the central podium. His translator was set to maximum volume, forcing everyone to pay attention. The Xerxian Empire has concerns about the unchecked expansion of human colonies, Zox began. Their aggressive mining operations, their military vessels disguised as traders, their refusal to acknowledge historical claims to certain systems. Keith listened as the Xerxian leader presented a distorted version of events along the border, painting humans as dangerous, unpredictable newcomers threatening galactic stability. For the safety of all Confederation members, Zox concluded, we propose the creation of neutral zones between our territories. These development regions would be administered jointly by the Council, requiring all human settlers to relocate within 3 standard months. Before Keith could request to respond, Elder Vexnor thanked the Xerxian for his presentation and announced a brief recess. The human delegation was deliberately ignored. As representatives mingled during the break, Keith's communicator vibrated with an urgent message. He stepped aside to read it, his face growing pale. What is it? Colonel Wright asked. New Montana is under attack, Keith said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Full Xerxian assault. They dropped out of hyperspace and opened fire on the main settlement. Video feed shows civilian buildings burning. Grace Patterson pulled up the data on her tablet. Casualty reports coming in. At least 300 dead already. Keith strode across the chamber directly to Elder Vexnor, breaking protocol by approaching without invitation. Elder, I must address the council immediately. The Xerxian Empire has launched an attack on a human colony. We have confirmed reports of civilian casualties. The ancient alien regarded Keith with unreadable eyes. These are serious allegations, Ambassador Bennett. The Council cannot act on unverified reports of what may be a regional border dispute. People are dying while we stand here, Keith insisted. The proper protocol is to submit evidence to the Verification Committee, which will investigate and report their findings. This process typically requires. How long? Keith interrupted. For matters of this complexity, perhaps 3 to 4 standard months, the elder replied calmly. Keith stared in disbelief. 3 months. The colony will be ashes by then. The Confederation has maintained peace for millennia by following established procedures, Ambassador. Your species' impatience is noted, but not relevant to our processes. When the session resumed, Elder Vexnor made no mention of the attack. Instead, he announced that the Council would form a committee to study the Xerxian proposal for development zones, with recommendations to be presented within 6 months. Keith watched as Grand Imperator Zox's crest fluttered in satisfaction. The Xerxian caught Keith's eye across the chamber and made a small gesture that needed no translation. This is already decided. That evening, as reports of destruction continued to arrive from New Montana, Keith sat alone in his quarters. On his desk lay the carefully prepared speech he had written, full of diplomatic language and respectful appeals to Confederation principles. He picked it up, read the first paragraph, then slowly tore it to pieces. Keith spent the night writing a new speech. As the artificial dawn once again spread across Galaxia Prime, he gathered his team for a final briefing. "What I'm about to do will change everything," he told them, his voice steady. "Once I speak these words, there's no going back for Earth or for any of us." Diane looked worried. "The Council could expel us from the Confederation." "They might," Keith agreed. "But I believe there are others who feel as we do. Newer species who have been pushed around and ignored." Colonel Wright studied the latest reports from New Montana. "The death toll is over 800 now. 3 towns completely destroyed. And still no response from the Council?" Keith asked. Lisa shook her head. "The official statement calls it concerning regional tensions and promises to evaluate the situation. Meanwhile, more exertion ships have been spotted moving toward our other border colonies." Keith nodded grimly. "Then we proceed as planned. Grace, is our communication system ready?" "Yes, Ambassador. It will bypass the Council filters and transmit your speech to every human outpost and embassy. I've also managed to connect to several independent news networks run by non-aligned species." "Good," Keith said. "Let's go make history." The Council chamber was even more crowded on this second day. Word had spread of the events at New Montana, creating a buzz of conversation as the human delegation took their seat. Keith noticed several representatives from younger species watching him with interest. Elder Vexnor opened the session with a brief mention of incidents in the Outer Territories before moving to scheduled business. For 2 hours, Keith sat quietly as minor matters were discussed. Finally, Elder Vexnor announced that the exertion proposal regarding human territories would be referred to committee. "Before we conclude today's session," the Elder added, "the representative from Earth has requested time to address the Council regarding their concerns. The Council grants 5 minutes, as is customary for junior members." Keith approached the central podium, feeling hundreds of alien eyes upon him. The timer on the podium began counting down from 5 minutes. In the third ring, Grand Imperator Zox watched with barely concealed amusement. "Honorable representatives of the Galactic Confederation," Keith began, his voice calm. "I stand before you today to thank you for the wisdom and guidance you have shown humanity since we joined your community of worlds." A few surprised murmurs rippled through the chamber. This was not the angry protest many had expected. "For 5 years, we have learned from your ancient cultures, studied your laws, and tried to be worthy members of this confederation." Keith paused, looking around the chamber. "And for 5 years, we have watched as you ignored violations of your own principles when it was convenient to do so." The murmurs grew louder. Elder Vexenor's eyes narrowed. "Yesterday, as we sat in this very chamber discussing development zones, the Exertion Empire launched an unprovoked attack on the human colony of New Montana." Keith activated the holographic projector built into the podium. Suddenly, the chamber was filled with images of burning buildings, injured civilians, and Exertion warships in orbit around a small blue-green world. 837 dead, Keith continued, his voice harder now. Farmers, teachers, children, while this council speaks of committees and procedures and proper protocols. This is not appropriate material for, Elder Vexnor began, but Keith continued speaking over him. "We came to you seeking alliance, friendship, and common purpose," Keith stated, his voice steady despite the elder's attempt to silence him. "Instead, we found indifference to suffering, political calculation over justice, and cowardice disguised as caution." The chamber erupted in outrage as translation systems conveyed his words to every species present. Grand Imperator Zox rose from his seat, his crest fully extended in anger. "The representative from Earth is out of order," Elder Vexnor declared, activating the chamber's override system to cut off Keith's microphone. But Grace had bypassed the system. Keith's voice continued to ring out, not just in the chamber, but across thousands of worlds as she transmitted his words through independent channels. "Humanity did not journey to the stars to become victims," Keith declared, looking directly at the Exertion delegation. The timer on the podium hit 0, but he made no move to step away. If this confederation cannot protect its members, then it's time for war. Chaos erupted in the council chamber. Delegates shouted over each other, while Elder Vex Nor repeatedly struck his ceremonial staff against the floor, calling for order. Security officers hurried toward the central podium, where Keith stood calmly, having said what he came to say. Ambassador Bennett, you are hereby removed from these proceedings, Elder Vex Nor declared once the noise had somewhat subsided. The human delegation will return to their quarters until the council determines an appropriate response to this unprecedented breach of protocol. 6 security officers escorted Keith and his team from the chamber. Instead of returning them to their original quarters, they were taken to a different section of the station's outer ring. More luxurious accommodations, but with locked doors and disabled communications. Diplomatic house arrest, Lisa observed as the security team departed. I've seen worse prisons. Keith walked to the window, looking out at the massive structure of Galaxia Prime. How long before they cut our access to the station's network? They already tried. Grace replied with a small smile, activating her tablet. But they don't understand our technology as well as they think. We're still connected, and my broadcast went out perfectly. Every human settlement received your speech. So did at least 30 non-aligned worlds and dozens of colonies belonging to Junior Confederation members. Any response yet? Keith asked. Our inbox is flooded, Diane said, scrolling through messages. Earth government officials, colonial administrators, military commanders. And look at this. Messages from representatives of 8 different Confederation species requesting private meetings. Which species? Colonel Wright asked, looking over her shoulder. The Thrix, the Murloci, the Gramorians. Diane read off the list. All junior members, all with territories near exertion space. Keith nodded. Just as I thought. We're not the only ones the Council has been sacrificing to keep the exertions happy. For the next 6 hours, they received a steady stream of visitors. Council security seemed unable or unwilling to prevent other diplomats from finding their way to the human quarters. Each visitor shared similar stories. Border violations by exertion ships, resources stolen, outposts threatened, all while the Council urged patience and restraint. The insectoid Thrix ambassador, her mandibles clicking anxiously, showed them footage of exertion mining ships stripping resources from a Thrix moon. For 2 years we have filed complaints. The Council does nothing. The aquatic Murloci representative, floating in his water-filled environmental suit, described exertion seizures of their trading vessels. They claim our ships violated their space, but the coordinates prove this is false. Still, the Council advises us to avoid confrontation. Most surprising was the visit from a Velmaxi trade minister, a member of one of the elder species. He entered cautiously, checking for surveillance before speaking. Not all of the founding members support the Council's current path, he said quietly. Some of us remember when the exertions were allowed to join the Confederation despite concerns about their expansionist history. We were overruled then, as voices of caution are being overruled now. Colonel Wright took charge of these meetings, discussing potential military coordination while Diane drafted preliminary alliance proposals. By nightfall, representatives from 12 species had visited their quarters. We're not alone, Keith said as the last visitor departed. That's something. But is it enough? Lisa asked. The exertion fleet outnumbers any single species. That's why the Council is so reluctant to challenge them. The exertions are counting on everyone remaining divided, Keith replied. What happens if we stand together? At midnight, station time, a message arrived from Earth. President Roger Mason had called an emergency session of the United Earth Government. Keith and his team gathered around Grace's tablet to watch the recorded broadcast. Citizens of Earth and her colonies, President Mason began, his face grave. Today, our ambassador to the Galactic Confederation delivered a message that many will find shocking. After careful review of the evidence, and in light of the unprovoked attack on New Montana, I must inform you that the United Earth Government stands firmly behind Ambassador Bennett's words. The president paused, looking directly into the camera. For too long, we have placed our trust in a system that does not value all its members equally. That ends today. I have authorized the immediate mobilization of the Earth Defense Fleet. We do not seek war, but we will no longer accept peace at the price of human lives. Keith turned to his team, his expression resolute. And so it begins. News of Earth's military mobilization spread quickly across the Confederation. On Galaxia Prime, the Council called an emergency session that lasted for 18 hours, while the human delegation remained under house arrest. "They're panicking," Grace said, monitoring communications from their quarters. "Several elder species are demanding our expulsion from the Confederation. Others are calling for a diplomatic solution." "And the Exurgents?" Keith asked. "Grand Imperator Zox has formally accused Earth of violating Confederation peace protocols. He's demanding we surrender our border colonies as a gesture of good faith." Keith smiled slightly. "I think we've made our position on that quite clear." Back on Earth, Admiral Nancy Ortega stood in the command center of the orbital defense platform, Guardian. Around her, officers monitored screens showing the movement of ships throughout human space. 1st, 3rd, and 7th combat groups are now at full readiness. "Madam President," she reported via secure channel to President Mason. "All colony defense systems are activated." "What about the research vessels?" the President asked. Admiral Ortega's expression remained professional, but there was a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "All ships previously classified as research vessels have revealed their true capabilities and joined their designated combat groups. For 5 years, humanity had presented a carefully crafted image to the Confederation, a young, somewhat naive species still developing their space capabilities. Few among the elder races knew that Earth had been building and disguising warships as civilian vessels, preparing for the day when diplomatic niceties might fail. Across human colonies, militia units that had trained in secret now moved to defensive positions. Hidden weapon emplacements powered up. On New Montana, despite the ongoing Exurgent attacks, the colonists had activated underground bunkers and defense systems that the Exurgents had never detected. Most importantly, Earth's quantum communications network, technology the humans had claimed was still theoretical, came online, connecting all human settlements in real time, bypassing the Confederation's monitored channels. Admiral Ortega received an alert on her command console. "Madam President, we've detected Exurgent fleet movements. 3 battle groups are heading toward the Thrix homeworld." "The Thrix?" President Mason looked surprised. "Not our colonies." "No, ma'am. It appears that Exurgents are moving against what they perceive as the weakest potential ally in our emerging coalition." The President's decision was immediate. "Contact the Thrix government. Tell them Earth stands with them. Deploy the 3rd Combat Group to their defense." On Galaxia Prime, Elder Vexnor himself came to the human quarters, accompanied by 4 security officers. His ancient face was set in lines of grave disappointment. "Ambassador Bennett, the Council has reviewed your actions and finds them deeply troubling," he said formally. "We require Earth to stand down its military forces immediately as a show of commitment to Confederation principles." Keith regarded the elder calmly. "And what about the Exurgent forces attacking our colonies? Will they also stand down?" "The Council is addressing those concerns through appropriate diplomatic channels." "The time for diplomacy passed when the first human died on New Montana," Keith replied. "But I'm curious, what happens if we refuse your request?" Elder Vexnor's expression hardened. "Then the Council will have no choice but to consider Earth's actions as hostile to the peace of the Confederation." "I see. And if the Exurgents continue their attacks?" "The Council is confident that with proper negotiations—" "You haven't answered my question, Elder," Keith interrupted. "If the Exurgents continue killing humans while you negotiate, what will the Council do?" The Elder's silence was answer enough. Keith nodded. "Please deliver this message to the Council. Earth will defend itself and any peaceful worlds threatened by aggression. Those who stand with us will find humanity a loyal ally." Those who stand against us will discover that humans are not as weak as you believed." As Elder Vexenor departed, a message arrived from Admiral Ortega. Human fleet has engaged Exerxian forces near Thrick's homeworld. Thrick's defense forces fighting alongside us. Murlokai and Grimorian ships en route to join battle. Colonel Wright read the message and looked up at Keith. "It's begun. The first major engagement." "Not just a battle," Keith said quietly. "The beginning of a new galactic order." 6 months passed. What began as a single battle near the Thrick's homeworld expanded into what historians would later call the Liberation War. The Exerxian Empire, confident in their superior numbers, had not expected coordinated resistance from species they had bullied for decades. They had especially underestimated humanity. Earth ships proved faster and more advanced than anyone had suspected. Human tactics confused the Exerxians, who were accustomed to the predictable responses of Confederation forces. Most importantly, the coalition that formed around Earth grew stronger each week as more species joined the fight. On Galaxia Prime, the Great Council chamber was half empty. Many representatives had returned to their homeworlds as the conflict spread. Elder Vexenor and the remaining council members debated endlessly while their influence diminished. Keith Bennett, no longer under house arrest but still closely watched, had established a parallel council of allied species. They met in the station's outer ring, once a symbol of junior status, now the center of a new power in the galaxy. "The Exergians have withdrawn from the Paraxian sector," reported the Thrick's ambassador, her compound eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Our combined fleet has secured all major jump points. The liberation of 3 Murlokai trading outposts is complete," added their representative. "For the first time in 50 years, our ships move freely through those routes." Keith nodded, studying the strategic display that showed the current state of the conflict. Nearly half the known galaxy now aligned with what was being called the Defensive Coalition. The Exerxian Empire had lost a third of its territory and showed signs of internal fracturing. Ambassador Bennett, his assistant, called from the doorway. "A message from Elder Vexenor. The full council requests your presence immediately." The council chamber felt different as Keith entered it once more. The seats of the Exerxian delegation were empty. Their representatives had fled weeks earlier when evidence of their planned conquests became public. Several elder species had moved their seats closer to the center, abandoning the traditional rings that had defined Confederation hierarchy for thousands of years. Elder Vexenor looked aged beyond his years as he addressed Keith. "The Council recognizes the representative of Earth and the Defensive Coalition." Keith approached the central podium, the same spot where 6 months earlier he had declared that it was time for war. Now he came with a different purpose. "Honorable representatives," he began, "for 6 months, blood has been shed across the stars. The Exerxian threat has been pushed back, but at great cost to all our peoples. Today, I come with the authority of 32 species to propose terms for peace." Keith activated the podium's display, showing a new map of galactic territories. "The Defensive Coalition will guarantee the security of all peaceful worlds, regardless of species or history. No more will the strong prey upon the weak while others stand by in the name of non-interference." His eyes found Elder Vexenor's. "The old Confederation may continue as a cultural and economic alliance, but military matters and security concerns will be addressed by a new body where all members have equal voice, regardless of how long they have traveled the stars." The chamber was silent as Keith continued outlining the new galactic order. When he finished, Elder Vexenor rose slowly from his seat. "For 10,000 years, the Confederation has maintained our traditions," the ancient alien said. "Yet perhaps it is time for change." 1 week later, Keith stood with representatives from dozens of species as they signed the new charter. President Mason had traveled from Earth for the historic occasion, along with Admiral Ortega and other human leaders. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you made that speech?" President Mason asked quietly as they watched the signing ceremony. "Not exactly," Keith admitted. "I only knew that humans wouldn't accept being victims. Neither It turns out, would many others. As he looked around at the diverse species working together as equals, Keith reflected on the paradox of his position. He had come to Galaxia Prime as a diplomat, but had spoken of war. That willingness to fight had ultimately created the opportunity for a more just peace. Sometimes, he thought, you had to be ready for war to truly achieve peace.